Welcome to the Jay Martin Show, where we dissect the greatest minds in geopolitics and finance. Now, my guest today is Serhii Plokhii. He is a professor of Ukrainian history at Harvard and a multiple times best-selling author. And today we go deep into the Ukraine-Russian crisis. Now, a few of you are going to watch this interview and then you're going to jump down to the comments and you're going to say, Serhii is just blindly anti-Russian and has a strong bias, blah, 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 blah. Now, look, I did not agree with everything that Serhii had to say on this issue, right? But nothing about his opinions are blind. He is a true historian and has spent many years formulating his opinions. And if you disagree with them, all the more reason to listen to what he has to say. Because as you and I both know, way too many people these days spend all their time going towards the population that already agrees with everything they think and shares the same opinions. And they dismiss everything that is opposed to that, which is not good for anybody. They do this to their own demise. What you should do is allow your opinions to be challenged and welcome the opposition, because that is how you get smarter and your belief system gets stronger. So we covered a lot of ground today. Two major bullet points that we went into was the true American response to the collapse of the Soviet Union and how during 1989 to 1993, George H.W. Bush actually worked very hard to prevent the collapse of the Soviet Union. And you're going to want to find out why, because it matters today. We talk about that. The second major haymaker we discussed today was the true nuclear threat in this conflict is not nuclear weapons. Now, obviously, that is a massive threat, but the bigger threat and more near-term threat is the nuclear power plants in the conflict zones. And so we go deep into three of them today, which are right in the battlefields, surrounded by warfare, and what that potentially means and why nobody's talking about it. It's a big thing. So here is Serhii Plokhii. You're going to enjoy this one. Have fun.
This is Jay Martin.
Serhii Plokhii, thank you so much for joining me on the program today.
Jay, it's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
No, pleasure's all mine. There's a lot that I want to learn from you today. So I'm going to start with a bigger, broader question, and then we're just going to go down some rabbit holes as they come up. But to begin, Serhii, from your perspective, could you explain the historic roots of the tension between Russia and Ukraine, and most importantly, how they shape the current conflict today?
Yes, in very general terms, this is not conflict and war that are unfamiliar to the world in general. In my interpretation, this is part of the story of disintegration of one of the largest land-based empires in the world, the Russian Empire, that inherited from the Mongols a big space between the Pacific and the Carpathian Mountains. And that's where they built the empire, exactly in the place where the Mongols had theirs. And the 20th century is the century of the disintegration and fall of empires. From Ottoman to Austria-Hungary to British Empire to French Empire, Canada is one of the countries that emerged on the map of the world as an independent country in the 20th century. And that is also the story of the fall of the Soviet Union, which was an empire that was revived by the Bolsheviks, but also reshaped by the Bolsheviks. And many people in the world were convinced that the Bolsheviks, the Communist Party, was able to solve the nationality question, that the Soviet Union that took over the Russian imperial space would continue indefinitely. And it didn't happen. It fell apart, disintegrating into 15 different countries. And back in 1991, that's where it happened. Everyone believed, not just hoped, but believed that really history refused to repeat itself, that history may be ended, that there is no war or major war following the fall of empire. There were wars as part of the British Empire, disintegration of the British Empire, French Empire in Indochina, and so on and so forth. But with the Soviet Union, it was a war in Chechnya, and people believe that that was it. What we know today, what we understand today, that the largest land-based empire didn't go or doesn't want to go down without a fight. So Russia, which built the empire back starting from the 15th and 16th century, is trying to reclaim the territories, the former provinces, former republics of the Soviet Union. And Ukraine is essential for that project because Ukraine happened to be the second largest Soviet republic after Russia. So that's why we have, first of all, that conflict, and that's why the conflict is so big and intensive. This is the largest war in Europe since 1945. And looking at that from different perspectives, again, that can be the largest war in the world since 1945, since the fall of Berlin.
That's a really interesting take. I hadn't heard that before, that the 20th century was the century of the fall of empires. Now, so a couple questions off of that. So I can see that case. Yes, the collapse of the British Empire, maybe the Dutch Empire, not too far earlier than that. You referenced the French. First question, how do you reconcile that era with the birth and current existence of the American empire? And then I want to ask you some questions about the Soviet Union, but let's go to this one first. How do you reconcile the 20th century being the fall of the era of empires with today's American world order?
Yeah, the trick is not to use the term empire too broadly, because you can use this term now to define a business empire, an academic empire, and
Sure.
so on and so forth. The traditional empire has its features and its characteristics, and it means that it's basically lack of a sovereignty for a particular place, and it's basically a control from either London or Paris or Istanbul or particular territory, right? India is an example of being British colony for a long period of time until the end of World War II, 1945. So that is classic empire. British Empire is maritime empire. The Mongol Empire that I talked about, the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, are basically land-based empire. So that's the difference. Now, when you move into the post-1945 period and let's say talk about the United States of America, which emerges as the largest, the most powerful country in the world as the result of World War II. People normally focus on the war with Germany and Japan. Well, those were attempts of those countries to join the club of big nations, which failed. The biggest story of World War II is that the United States replaced Britain as the country that controlled maritime trade and controlled finances. So was the main financial center. The dollar retakes the place of British pound and so on and so forth. So that's one of the biggest changes of the 20th century. And United States also looked differently at actually what empire is and how to manage it. It refused to go the way of the old empires of the past because it was believed that it was not just morally repugnant. The United States came into existence in revolt against the British Empire, but it's also financially and economically makes no sense. So United States projects its power with the help of the control of the financial system, with the control of the maritime trade, by its economic power, without assuming direct responsibility for what is happening in the world, right? So what is happening in India, who is running India, who is running Zimbabwe or any other country. And also the difference is that if the British Empire, you can put it on the map and see it would be in red, and French Empire, you can do the same, and you can think about the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union, you can locate them on the map. Speaking about the American empire, quote unquote empire, you can't actually put it on the map because the reach is global. So if we insist on the use of term empire, we should also recognize that we deal in American case in the 21st century with a very different animal than the traditional empires of the 20th century. And I'll just give you one example of how different it is. Russia's war on Ukraine today. You have already Russia annexing and including into its constitution 4 of Ukrainian regions. And the war is not over yet. There can be other territorial claims as well. These parts they want to include into the Russian state. The United States is engaged in numerous wars and military conflicts around the world, but there was no attempt to turn Afghanistan into the 51st state of the United States of America, or to do the same, let's say, with Iraq. And that's a big difference. This is a huge difference. So again, we can, in American case, empire, it's more a metaphor. In the Russian case, in the case of the 20th century empires, that's a very, very clear definition of what the state looked like, what the ambitions were, and so on.
Okay, thank you for making that distinction, and that does make sense. And a couple threads I'd love to pull on that question, but before that, I want to get back to the Soviet Union, because you've written many books. You wrote one book specifically on the misconception of the American establishment when it came to the fall of the Soviet Union. What I mean is, we were all told a story, and we believe a story that the American government wanted the fall and the collapse of the Soviet Union. And you dispute this belief quite comprehensively. And so could you walk me through the major misconceptions about the end of the Soviet Union, especially from the Western perspective, and why the United States' goal may not have been dissolution of the Soviet Union as it was publicly believed to be?
Yeah, a lot of the American, in particular, discussion of the end of the Cold War, which is depending on the author, can be either 1989, the fall of Berlin Wall, or 1991, the fall of the Soviet Union. So a lot of that debate is focused on who really should be credited for that. Ronald Reagan, there is a view of that by confronting the Soviets in 1980s, challenging them by launching the development of the so-called Star Wars, the Strategic Defense Initiative, so trying to bring the arms and into the space that Reagan bankrupted the Soviet Union and really caused it disintegration. Then other argument is, no, it happened under Bush Sr. And the trick is that neither Reagan nor Bush Sr., none of them wanted the fall of the Soviet Union, which is sort of counterintuitive because we have Cold War. We have this nuclear competition between the two superpowers. And the argument that the fall of the Soviet Union was brought by Cold War and another superpower seems logical.
Sure.
The reality is that was never American goal. And the key reason for that is that the competition during the Cold War was a competition between two nuclear superpowers. That's why we didn't have the global war for so long since the end of World War II. You look, World War I, 1914, 1918. Then by 1939, 20 years later, you have already the start of World War II. We are now counting, 70, 80 years without a global conflict. And one of the reasons for that is nuclear weapons. The global conflict, people can't imagine today without use of nuclear weapons. And it's difficult to imagine the nuclear war without major destruction to the world as a whole, in particular to the countries that participate in it. So that's why we had Cold War and not hot war. But that's also why United States didn't want disintegration of the Soviet Union, because they were concerned about the nuclear arsenal, either the second or the first largest nuclear arsenal in the world. And that's the scenario that is different really to imagine. It's impossible really to calculate. You don't know what will happen there. So the plan was that the Soviet Union would continue under Brezhnev under Gorbachev, Mikhail Gorbachev, the last Soviet leader, as a junior partner of the United States.
So
and disintegration, that means, and that's what happened, creation of 4 nuclear states. One of them Russia, another Ukraine, another Belarus, another Kazakhstan. And then managing all sorts of risks associated with that. So nuclear arsenal that Russia has today is one of the reasons why Washington is so reluctant to provide Ukraine in timely manner with the weapons that Ukraine requests or Ukraine needs, because the concern are red lines in Putin's mind. What those red lines are, they're not about sending more troops to the front line. They're not about sending more tanks to the front line. They're about a potential nuclear confrontation. So nuclear age, as it started in 1945, again, people probably watched Oppenheimer and know the story, if not from books, then from that particular movie. It really changed a lot of calculations, and also the way how wars end. Either the Cold War, or we are looking now at the Russia-Ukrainian war. We don't know how it will end, but we know that nuclear is an important part of concerns and calculations.
And so in the years of the Cold War, as opposed as the ideologies were between America and the Soviet Union, it was kind of like the devil you know is better than the devil you don't scenario, where Gorbachev may have been the enemy, quote unquote. But as I understand, he was more liked than Yeltsin when Yeltsin came to office and took the reins after that. But also because the Soviet Union was a nuclear threat, but it was a consolidated nuclear threat, where after the fall, now you have sort of decentralized nuclear threats, as you mentioned, in Belarus and Kazakhstan, in Ukraine, and of course still in Russia. And that's a much harder scenario to control. And if you're the superpower, what you want is control, right? And an enemy under your thumb is better than rogue guerrilla warfare that you have less insight into. Does that sum it up a little bit?
Exactly. And what they were concerned about the scenario that is happening today, the Russo-Ukrainian war, in the situation when both Russia and Ukraine have nuclear weapons. So that was the scenario that they were trying to avoid. And by removing nuclear weapons from Ukraine, they were removed under pressure from the United States and Russia. They made sure that the war would not be between the two republics would not be nuclear, but they made that war more likely, not less likely, because nuclear deterrent was removed from Ukraine, and the legal instruments that they were trying to use, like assurances of assistance and help. The name for that agreement was Budapest Memorandum. It was signed in 1994. So those assurances, those legal or semi-legal instruments didn't work.
So you could interpret that as almost like counter to America's push to expand NATO into Ukraine. If your concern is the nuclear threat inside of Russia, then why press up against the border, the historic borderlands, and why antagonize the country that you're trying to control and trying to pacify? What do you think was the rationale behind that? And was that a smart or very poor decision?
Well, first of all, the incentive of expanding NATO didn't come from the United States and was looked at very suspiciously by Bush and originally by Clinton as well. But going back to the story of the disintegration of the Russian Empire, the countries in Eastern Europe, like Poland, in the Baltic states, like Latvia, were really, after not just decades, but centuries being under the Russian control, realized that the fall of the Soviet Union was their their chance, their moment, that Russia would be back, and it looked like they got it right, and that their own way to assure that Russia doesn't take them over militarily was NATO, was the Western alliance, was protection. Again, they got it right. Russia is reluctant to start a conventional war against the Baltic states, against Lithuania, or against Poland. There are threats, but there are cyber attacks, but there is no conventional warfare. So they were knocking on the doors of Washington for a long period of time. And Washington reluctantly, and then other European countries, including Germany, agreed to expand European Union and expand NATO closer to the Russian borders, but not exactly on the border with Russia. That's why when Ukraine started to knock on the same doors, the answer was, well, maybe in some distant future, but not now. Mm-hmm. And if you check the news of today, what Zelensky wants from NATO is not acceptance of Ukraine into NATO today, but promise that Ukraine would join NATO today, and NATO is reluctant to do that. So that story is also the story of Poland and Lithuania and other East European countries, which were running away from the imperial legacy, were running away from Russia. And they got on that train. Ukraine missed the train. The train left by the time Ukraine got to the train station. And that's also, apart from the nuclear story, that's story or background for this war. One more thing in terms of the threat that NATO poses or allegedly poses to Russia. I have no doubt that neither Putin nor anybody else in Moscow was happy or would be happy with the movement of NATO borders closer to the Russian territory. But Putin or anybody else is not really concerned that NATO would attack. Because what happened as the result of Russia's attack of Ukraine was that countries like Finland and Sweden joined NATO, realizing the threat that was coming. Finland, in particular, by joining NATO, expanded twice now the length of the border between Russia, the Russian Federation, and NATO countries. Twice. So if NATO would be a threat for Putin and the Russian government, you would expect that if not every Russian soldier that fights today in Ukraine, but at least half of them would be moved to the border with NATO that now expanded twice. No single soldier was moved to protect Russian border with NATO. I was talking recently to people in the government in Finland. They're telling me the border on the Russian side is empty. There is no one there. Everyone is fighting in Ukraine. That was not a NATO country. And we now know from the recently published book by Bob Woodward, The War on the Negotiations and Situation in Washington, that there were clear messages sent again and again to Putin that Ukraine would not be a member of the alliance in any foreseeable future. So the fact that Moscow was not happy about NATO expansion, yes, but that the NATO was the real reason for the war, for the reasons I just outlined, I have very difficult time believing that. Okay.
I appreciate that. Now, let me ask you another question. What is America's incentive to be so present and so supportive? And you could argue they could be more so or shouldn't be as much. But, you know, the perspectives that I often hear on this show, recently I had Colonel McGregor on this program, Colonel Douglas McGregor. And, you know, his take is Washington is donor occupied territory. And companies like BlackRock have massive contracts to rebuild the infrastructure in a post-war era. That's the incentive for American to continue fueling this war in back channels or directly. Senator Lindsey Graham has come out and said, Ukraine is sitting on trillions of dollars of natural resource wealth. We need that. He's been quite open about his stance, which is odd, but that's his take. What's your take, Serhii, on America's incentive to support the Ukrainians in this war?
The American policy since Obama and Biden's policies in many ways continuation of that, and Trump policy is basically different in some ways but similar in others. But starting with Obama through Trump to Biden, the policy is more or less the same. United States wants to basically refocus on the Pacific. United States wants to refocus on China. There is a consensus in Washington that China is the real threat. And the plan was, certainly in Obama and Biden administration, to quote unquote park Russia, somehow to get some form of agreement with Russia, which really puts us aside, doesn't distract American attention, that America could focus on China. That was the Biden's plan. And when the intelligence information started to arrive in Washington that Putin was going to attack, that he was amassing troops on the Ukrainian border, and that was not a blackmail, that he was going to go into Ukraine. What Washington did, Biden in particular, he tried to engage in negotiations. He tried to stop that. But at the end, the idea was, okay, every American citizen should leave Ukraine. Embassies were packed. Canadian embassy was packed. Western embassies were packed, and all left Kyiv. Why? Because the expectation was Kyiv would fall in a few days. Mm-hmm. The expectation was that they didn't want actually the American or Western citizens to get caught into all of that, because that could provoke a sort of the direct confrontation. So the idea was that, okay, we are withdrawing behind the NATO borders, and there is Article 5, and that's what we defend. So Ukraine was written off in the first day of the start of the war. The message was sent to Moscow, okay, you are making a mistake. There will be a price to pay in terms of the sanctions. And if there will be a guerrilla warfare, we will actually support it, like Mujahideens in Afghanistan. So that was the plan. And Kyiv refused to fall in 3 days. Ukraine fought back. And US and the West returned by April, trying to reevaluate the situation, thinking, okay, the guys have an army, the guys are prepared to fight, let's help them. And by May and June of 2022, the first actually serious significant shipments of military equipment, weaponry, and things like that started to reach Ukraine. So that's the story. The fact that corporations are interested potentially in Ukrainian mineral resources, I have no doubt about that. The question is the price, right? Mm. And at least the political elite, the government, Western governments had written Ukraine off already in February of 2022. It was a big surprise that Ukraine survived. So again, it's easy to imagine the world as being ruled by basically business interests and plans. They certainly are there. We know that. But as Napoleon was saying, no plan actually survives the first minute of the actual battle.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm prepared to consider those business interests, but I am I read too much history to assume that this is the only factor that is out there, or that this is the driving factor.
Yeah, that makes sense. No plan survives the first minute of battle. That was Napoleon. I used to have a comparable quote up on my wall. It was Mike Tyson. He says, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. Very similar.
Yes.
Similar statement. Okay, look, I want to pull on one thing here. So I agree. The American establishment is very focused on the Pacific. And, you know, I have a lot of establishment figures on this podcast. They all say the same thing. China is the number one threat. We need to be more focused on China. Actually, this book right behind me is written by Elbridge Colby, who wrote the National Defense Strategy for the White House in 2018. The book's called The Strategy of Denial. He's critiquing all the establishment figures who are denying that China is the real threat. It's very, very common. But so I see that and I agree with it. What I don't understand is that if Ukraine was written off on day one of the war, because the assumption was that Kyiv would fall very, very soon. And it didn't. But is that enough to inspire America to say, okay, they have a fighting chance, let's now get involved? If their strategy is the Pacific, I mean, I don't mean to sound inhumane, but it's kind of like, well, who cares? It's their fight. And if Ukraine's put up a good fight, good for them. If they fall soon, like we thought they would, too bad. But our focus is the Pacific. So just because the Ukrainians can put up a larger fight than we expected, why was that enough to change the American attention? And was, you know, where I go is like, well, maybe they were responding to public sentiment at home, right? The uprisings on the streets of America were very pro-Ukraine in many cities, and politicians are going to respond to the people. Maybe that's what redirected the attention. But what's your take, Serhii? If the focus was the Pacific, why worry about Europe at all?
Two reasons interconnected. The one is that this is a most blatant violation of the existing international order. The war started really in 2014, not in 2022, with the annexation of the Crimea. That was the first annexation of territory in Europe since 1945. And US and Europe were basically looking at that as one-off thing, a bump on the road to increase in better relations. And then came 2022, which suggested, okay, all these calculations that Russia can be satisfied with one piece of territory or another turned out to be wrong. The Balts, the Poles, the members of the NATO were saying, okay, if Ukraine falls, we are the next. Mm. So the threat after Crimea, each new victory for Russia would lead for actually next step and expansion. Russia never gave up on the Baltic states, which were part of the Soviet Union, despite the fact that they are members of NATO and members of European Union. And that was the position of many countries. It's better to take the fight on the territory which is not part of NATO and on the territory of Ukraine. And Ukraine, frankly, offers to the US and to the West the deal that they never had before. Ukraine doesn't ask about boots on the ground. Ukraine came to the NATO and to the US with basically a message that was formulated by Churchill back in 1941 at the start of World War II, when Churchill said, "Give us the tools and we'll finish the job." Mm-hmm. Right? So that was not the deal in Vietnam. That was not the deal in Afghanistan. That was not the deal in Iraq. Ukraine has a fighting army that didn't disappear like the Afghan army overnight when the American troops were removed. So that was, if you think strategically, well, things like that don't come too often if you have a country that is really present a threat to the international order, and the economic and political order is based on that. And you have a party that is prepared to fight. What they're asking for are financial support and weapons. So that's something that is turned out to be very, very appealing. And then linked to that, and you talked about that already, the violation of international order, that is something that is understood on a different level, not just by the policymakers, not by the statesmen, but also people on the street. You have unprovoked aggression of a major country against its neighbor, which heroically defends itself, which also happened to be a democratic country when Russia happened to be autocratic and authoritarian country. So that's what you got in Europe. That's what you got in West, this really support for Ukraine. By people who had no connection to Ukraine, couldn't find it on the map before that. And this is a very different story from what we see in so-called global South. For a number of reasons, but also one of them is that the values that Ukraine defends, including democracy, are the values that are close to the heart in the West, but actually are much, much more, I would say, less important or more controversial in most of what is defined today as global South. So there were strategic reasons, and then there were these moral reasons, and that's where the governments and the public in the West came together.
Okay, and so if I were to wrap that up a little bit, what you see maybe, and tell me if I'm off base here, what you see as Putin's motivation, true motivation, long-term vision and plan, is effectively the reunification of the 15 independent countries that were formed during the fall of the Soviet Union. It's the complete and eventual resurgence of the Soviet Union. And that's why the Poles were so vocal when Ukraine was invaded, because they said, look, we know what's going to happen here. This is one after the next in sequential order. It makes sense to go to Ukraine next. They're not a NATO country, but we are. And I mean, Poland's been invaded many, many times. It's a country that's very familiar to occupation. So it's a very real threat. I think that's probably why they're the European country that invests most heavily in their military. I think they lead in terms of NATO countries and GDP contribution to their military, because they understand what occupation is like. It's happened so frequently. Is that accurate? Because, the counterpoint would be that Russia's pushing back on the borderlands. We talked about this. The borderlands are the only thing that's kept Moscow alive. When Napoleon invaded, there was too much land to cross. The borderlands protected Russia. When Hitler invaded, there was too much land to cross. The borderlands protected Russia. Without those, Moscow feels very insecure and unstable. And maybe that's enough, but is the bigger picture, you believe, true reunification of the entire Soviet Union and a resistance against the century of the fall of empires, right? This is the last land empire that's clinging on here, and they're not going down without a fight, as you mentioned.
Certainly Putin and the Russian elite at that time, they considered the fall of the Soviet Union to be something that is not historically justified, that happened because of mistakes made, let's say, by Gorbachev, by Yeltsin, and they think that they actually can turn the history back, that they can fix that problem. The fall happened so fast that this generation that is in power now really didn't have enough time to comprehend it and to adjust their own political expectations and political planning to that. Unfortunately, that is happening in the context of major confrontation and major war. But they learned the lesson from the fall of the Soviet Union. They don't want the Soviet Union back because it was a project that cost a lot of money to Russia. They are thinking more or less in the terms of the reestablishing of control over the post-Soviet space, indirect control, a form of neo-imperialism or neo-colonialism, when you are not responsible for paying pensions somewhere in Tajikistan or in Kazakhstan or in some other place, but you control it economically, politically, and militarily. So that's the goal. That's the Russian vision of the world is a multipolar world. And for Russia to be one of the poles in the world, they need the resources of the post-Soviet space. On their own, they're not even part of the 10 largest world economies, right? So they need those resources. And then depending on the individual republic, depending on the individual place, the scenario can be different. War against Ukraine started with the statement that Russians and Ukrainians were one and the same people, which really suggested that not that Russians were Ukrainians. It was saying that Ukrainians were Russians. And the same attitude is toward Belarus. So this is former Slavic core of the Russian Empire and Slavic core of the Soviet Union. So there, Putin is prepared to restore some form of the Soviet Union and move the borders. When it looks to Central Asia, when it looks to the Caucasus, I would say that this is more an idea of this form of imperial control that doesn't mean including those countries into the borders of future Russia. So broadly, the idea is to restore financial, economic, strategic control over the post-Soviet space, but then depending on the republic, there can be either inclusion of the Russia or it can be functioning as some sort of the dependency, Russian dependency.
Okay. You know, so much of these conflicts, when we analyze from the West, I feel like our misunderstanding, I mean, I'm in Canada, you know, I spent a lot of time in the US, and our understanding of both European and quite frankly, Asian conflicts is so limited because of how short our country's history is. When you live in a country that's been around for a couple hundred years, and then you hear Vladimir Putin on Tucker Carlson's show, and when he outlines his case for his invasion of Ukraine, he begins in the 15th century. And most American viewers are like, why is that relevant? This is so long ago. But it's Russian history. That's the history of the country that he leads. For us in the West, you know, it's hard to wrap our mind around the significance, but it's the same in China. When we look at the most significant events as pulled from mainland Chinese, often these events land in the 15th, the 17th, the 18th century. Events that us in the West don't hear about in our academic system as frequently. And it's a language barrier, I believe, you know, when you look at the world through the lens of your short-term history. Any comments on that? And then I want to pivot a little bit to something else.
Yes. For everyone who talks about the paramount importance of NATO and NATO expansion, in the origins of this war, I recommend really Tucker Carlson's show because here is an American reporter going to Russia to interview Putin, clearly with the hope that he can bring back home some sort of quotes and arguments that would be understood by the American public. And probably NATO is one of them, and is treated for 30 minutes of history lecture, where he is completely lost. And certainly his audience would actually not know even where to start. And you said 15th century, he starts actually in the 10th century and 11th century, right? So that is about Putin's obsession with the history. And claim that really Kiev should be Russian. So that's very, very particular message to those who point finger at NATO, at the United States, at other things. That's what is the highest priority for the person who is most responsible for this war. Then, of course, there is for me as a historian, it was interesting to see, because what Putin gives, he gives an imperial narrative coming from the 19th century. This is just refusal to adapt to the world, not even of the 21st century, but of the 20th century. In that historical reading and argument, the country that, let's say, like Canada, didn't exist in the 15th or 16th century has no right to exist. So only empires have legitimacy, right? So that would delegitimize 70% of the countries on these historical grounds that exist today in the world and justify aggression against them. So that's the real message of the history lecture that was given. But again, for me as a historian, I had this mixed feelings. On one hand, I was as a historian, I thought, okay, it's good that so much attention is paid to history. The bad part was that it was bad history. It was dated history. It was history that certainly a few historians in the world would associate themselves with.
Okay, I appreciate that, and that's really good perspective. That if you were to hold that same filter to present day world, you'd eliminate the independence of 70% of the world's countries. Yeah. Okay. I want to pivot to the nuclear threat a little bit, Serhii, because you've written a lot about this, and not just about the nuclear arsenal, but also about the occupation of nuclear facilities inside Ukraine. So if we could just start there, what do you see and what have you seen in the last couple of years since this invasion as the most significant nuclear threats that maybe the public isn't as aware of as they should be?
Yes. Well, Russia is in possession of either the largest or the second largest nuclear arsenal in the world. A lot changed since Cold War, but one thing didn't change. There are still two nuclear superpowers in the world. The United States is one, Russia is another, or you can put them in a different order. And there is a major disconnect between the Russian nuclear power and arsenal and its economic economic potential. Russia is a gigantic in terms of the nuclear arsenal. It's a dwarf when you look at its economy. That wasn't the case during the Soviet Union,
right,
during the Soviet times. So when Putin sends his troops in Ukraine in 2022, almost immediately there are these veiled and not so veiled threats that we can use nuclear weapons. And that is what most of the attention is focused on when it comes to this war and things nuclear. The potential by Russia of using nuclear weapons. I personally think that the nuclear threat is there with this war, but the focus is on wrong things. I see no reason to believe that Putin's nuclear threats, are anything but blackmail. The trick is Russia is a powerful nuclear state, but that's not the only nuclear state in the world. There are others that actually can, in case of escalation, they can respond to the Russian aggression. There are Russian allies like China who are very unhappy with any potential use of the nuclear weapons on the battlefield, whether strategic or tactical. So for Putin to use nuclear weapon, it would be, if not sign his own death sentence, then certainly signing a death sentence for his regime. Because even his allies or people who are sitting on the fence, like India, keep sending very clear messages, and the United States also is part of that, that actually there are very serious consequences that could come with that. Putin is not suicidal. He is fully in control of at this point, at least, of media, of the political elite in Russia. There is no reason for him taking risks of that proportion. So I think it's a blackmail. I'm convinced that this is a blackmail. At least at this point, there is nothing suggesting that there is something real behind that. Putin, as Biden once said, he is a rational player. He miscalculated in 2022. But there is a real nuclear threat that came with the Russian occupation, first of Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Ukraine, And now Russians are in control of Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. A few months ago, Ukraine started its offensive in the Kursk region and moved into the Russian territory, stopping maybe 40, 50 kilometers away from Kursk nuclear power plant. So what we see for the first time in history, there is a lot of history in this war. We talked about that, but what is absolutely new is the army of one of the belligerents attacking and occupying a nuclear power plant. The Russian attack on Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, the largest nuclear power plant in Europe, was streamlined on YouTube channel. And everyone could see that actually there were missiles fired, that there were buildings on fire, and so on and so forth. The American representative in the Security Council said that it was by God's grace that the world actually avoided another nuclear arsenal. I, who try to think as rationally as I can, actually agree with that statement 100%. It was by God's grace that we didn't get into a major nuclear accident as the result of that. And as story with Ukraine approaching Kursk nuclear power plant shows, Chernobyl and Zaporizhzhia is not the end of the story. The story continues. I'll just use this opportunity to show my book on the occupation of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. It's called Chernobyl Roulette. Again, as anyone who played anything related to roulette know that there is that the outcome of that sort of game it's hard to predict. So we are in a situation where the nuclear threat is there, but it comes not from the potential use of nuclear weapons by Putin, but by the occupation of the nuclear sites at the time of the war. If you decide to use nuclear weapon, the price can be really a political price and otherwise can be humongous, because in this world it will be known very soon who fired nuclear missile, who sent the plane that dropped the nuclear bomb, where did it come from, where it was produced. When you are in control of the nuclear power plant, or you're attacking the area close to the nuclear power plant, what happens there is actually would be treated as an accident. There is no responsibility.
Yeah, there's
either it was your drone or somebody else's who did that. It's like with the destruction of the Kakhovka hydroelectric power dam in southern Ukraine. Ukrainians are pointing finger at Russia, Russia at Ukraine. The world says, okay, we don't know.
Yeah.
So that's if you want to create an accident. But accidents happen on their own, like Chernobyl, like Fukushima. And add to that conditions of the war, the stress that the operators are working under when they're being shot at, when they don't know what is happening with their families. So the nuclear power plants in the war zone, that is present, real and present danger that this war brought to the fore, much more serious than any threats coming from Moscow. My concern is that, as far as I can say, the world is not paying attention. Is not paying attention to where the real threat is coming from, and is distracted by something that maybe theoretically is possible, but is highly unlikely.
And that's why, if I'm correct, that's why you wrote the book Chernobyl Roulette, because you see this as the real nuclear threat. Everybody talks about, nukes being fired from one country or another at a target. Of course, terrifying scenario. We've seen it occur. It's horrible. But what you're saying is the probability is very low because of the response and results. However, and you wrote about sort of the candor of the Russian soldiers around the Chernobyl plants, the lack of respect for safety around things like spent fuel rods, and just the firefight that was occurring at a very high risk facility, and in Zaporizhzhia now as well, and then now the Ukraine's up in Kirks. So that is, and it could be, you're right, there's a number of ways that could occur. It could be just negligence on the part of the occupying soldiers, absolutely. It could be the emergence of combat, in one of these facilities with soldiers who are not worried about nuclear threat. They're worried about surviving the day, right? And so exactly. It's, you come out guns blazing if you're fighting for your life, and you're not so worried about potential implications down the road. And the third could be some kind of espionage scenario where you want an event to occur, and here's an opportunity to covertly provoke one, and gives you the opportunity of plausible deniability because, look, it was an accident. We don't know who did it, or it was definitely exactly the opposing forces. Yes?
Yes, exactly. And the trick is that to cause a nuclear accident or explosion, you don't need even to attack the nuclear power plant. One of the chapters in my book is called The Shadow of Fukushima. So what happened at Fukushima, the last major nuclear disaster in 2011, was that the earthquake and then tsunami, they caused a lot of damage. But the Japanese engineers, managers, they were ready for that. They were prepared for that. So they shut down the reactors. And the reactors survived. But what earthquake did, it destroyed the power lines that were bringing electricity to the nuclear power plant. And those were needed to keep pumping water to the overheated reactors. And because the power lines were destroyed, the Fukushima happened. 4 meltdowns, 4 reactors happened. So, and on a number of cases in Chernobyl, that's what I described, but also at Zaporizhzhia, because of the war in the area, the electric lines were cut, bringing electricity to the nuclear power plant, causing a potential for disaster. So that's just one more thing to keep in mind, that whoever fighting there cannot even understand what he is doing, right, or not paying attention that, okay, this power line was cut off. Who cares? As you said, the task is to survive the day, to advance here or to advance over there. So Ukraine now is raising alarm over the Russian attacks on the some points in the Ukrainian electric grid, close to the nuclear power plants, arguing that by destroying those, you can create actually instability in the grid system that actually can provoke can cause the nuclear accident. So yeah, we are here in uncharted waters very much. On the one hand, as I said, it's an old-fashioned war of the disintegration of empire and attempt of the former metropoly to regain some form of control over that former empire. On the other hand, this is the war of disintegration of empire that is being played out in the nuclear age with this new nuclear threat. So you take empire, you add nuclear, you get disaster.
You get disaster. And that's key to understand, because you're right. It's not just that one of these plants could be hit by a missile, something like this. It's that key infrastructure could be disrupted. And if a nuclear power plant loses access to electricity or water, that's a meltdown scenario. And so it could be indirect, could be kilometers away. But if key infrastructure is disrupted that is supplying the nuclear facility with...
I'll give you one additional example. We already mentioned the explosion, the destruction of the Kakhovka dam. What that did was that the big artificial lake on the Dnieper River created by that dam disappeared. That lake was the place from where the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant was taking water for cooling down the reactor. Now, what they did, they started to get water from underground. So they drilled. And for a while it was all good and it was all okay. But now, because the lake doesn't exist anymore, the level of underground water also went down. And there are also problems now getting actually enough water to cool the reactors. The good thing is that the reactors are being shut down now for a long period of time, but they're still, they and also the elements of the nuclear fuel, they still need water, they still need pumps, they need electricity. And that's another thing where probably no one was thinking in those terms.
And it's terrifying, Serhii, because if you think about the Fukushima meltdown as an example, there is an immediate and very coordinated effort to remedy that situation, right, and bring safety back to the region. And I'd say it was largely very successful in terms of, I think, eliminating casualties 100% and reducing the damage as much as possible. But that was only possible because of the coordinated and immediate response to that. Now, what's the probability that you could have that kind of a response in a conflict region, right? Where you got opposing forces on the ground, just tension. I mean, it's a scary one to wrap your mind around just because of the inability to get there and solve a problem. And who's going to do it, right?
It is. Such simple thing as the visit by the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, Rafael Grossi. He visited Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant twice. So the amount of the negotiations that went into that, negotiating with the Ukrainian side, negotiating with the Russian side, that there would be no fire opened at the caravan that would bring him from the Ukrainian side of the front line to Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant under Russian occupation. And then there were uncertainties and accidents. But this is just a visit by one and very high-level international official. Now imagine that you will need thousands and thousands of men, and where that would come from, and the roads are either mined or destroyed. Minefields are over there. I'll stop here. I don't want even to fully go into what sort of a nightmare it can be. But we have to think about that. We have to think about that because we don't do that. We are not ready. We are unprepared. And when I say we, I'm talking about the international community as a whole. Because as Chernobyl accident showed, the nuclear radiation, it doesn't recognize international borders.
Yeah. Yeah.
It travels without visa.
Sure.
And crosses borders, crosses oceans. So it's not, if something like that, God forbid, happens, it will not be just Russian-Ukrainian problem.
No. And I believe the Chernobyl disaster was exasperated because it was tough to get a coordinated response to that, because this is during the Cold War and the Russians needed American support to remedy this problem, but they weren't willing to be transparent with what had occurred. And so getting the right response equipment from Americans proved to be a failure because the scale of the accident was effectively lied about. And so an effective response was not triggered as immediately as it could have been, limiting casualties, limiting damage, et cetera, et cetera.
Exactly. And part of that Soviet reluctance was because the reactor at Chernobyl that exploded, it was dual-purpose reactor. It could be used also for producing plutonium, for the atomic bombs, hydrogen bombs, and so on and so forth. So again, there was a war component, military component into all of that, like it is, of course, now. So again, the case of international community not being able to help or even being reluctant to help, right? Going into the war zone. The representatives of the International Atomic Energy Agency that are now stationed at Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, they're not happy campers, right? They didn't sign up for that when they joined the International Atomic Energy Agency, going into the war zones.
So I want to ask some wrap up questions here, Serhii. And the first one would be, the probability of a peace outcome and what would need to occur for that. Like, is it realistic that the Ukraine retains full territorial integrity while ensuring peace and stability? Do you see an outcome where Russia moves towards a peace treaty despite having to give up some of the gained territory and lose some face internationally? Like, what's given what you understand about Putin's motives, about Ukrainian independent incentives, what's your take on the likelihood of a peace negotiation?
There's certainly, I don't exclude completely the scenario when Ukraine, in a short period of time, gets back to its 1991 borders. Last summer, we saw a mutiny in the Russian army. It's the Wagner group, the shock troops, rebelling against the regime. That was crushed. So the authoritarian regimes they look stable, they can be very unstable. So the scenario of political crisis, mutiny is a possibility. But I wouldn't give this possibility more than 5% chances. So 95% that Russia will continue the way how it goes. And looking at the history of other comparable conflicts, what comes to mind, war in Korea, when the United States was involved directly, when the Soviet Union was supplying the instructors, supplied weaponry, China entered in, and so on and so forth. So the country was divided eventually, with till now the issue being unresolved. So that's one possibility where there is a ceasefire. Now, when the war came to an end in Korea with the ceasefire, that was when both sides decided that they actually exhausted their resources, or resources that they were prepared to commit to that war, and that probably they would not achieve anytime soon improvement of their position on the front line. So applying that Korean example, I think that the likely scenario is a ceasefire along the existing front line, and no peace treaty, because again, peace treaty would suggest really changing and redrawing the borders. So it's basically we will deal with a territorial conflict that, in case between Russia and Japan, continues till today over the Kuril Islands. Yeah. There is no peace treaty since World War II between Russia and Japan. So this is likely scenario. So what remains to be unknown, when and at which point the two sides will decide that they and their allies, of course, that their chances are better at the negotiation table in the battlefield. That we don't know. We will see the Russia continues to supply enough troops to the front line to continue the war and continue slow, very costly, but advance on the front lines. Ukraine very much depends on the support of Western allies, and these are democratic governments in which the government position can change depending on the elections. American elections are coming up. Mm-hmm. So I think there will be a little bit more clarity in November and December of where we are in terms of the continuing Western support for Ukraine. And I think that the war is a major economic burden for Russia as well, for Russian economy. It's doing on one level very well. On the other, they have the bank rate is at 18%, which is not a great sign. So how much time they have to continue to go that way with the economy overheated by the military expenditures? Also, we don't know. That's a big factor. But in very general terms, again, I see armistice. I don't see a peace treaty as a likely scenario, and I see armistice at the point when the two sides decide that okay, they probably can't continue the warfare on that level. At least one side would decide. If Russia decides that, the West certainly will go along. There is no question about that.
Right. Okay. So more likely that we see a ceasefire along the existing front lines, ending the fighting, but maybe leaving the option of conflict open-ended in the future. Enough tension.
Yes, like partitioned Germany, like partitioned Korea, like partitioned Vietnam.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Okay. When you hear President Trump say, if he were to come to office, he would resolve this conflict in one day, what do you make of statements like that?
The way how I understand it, that actually within the first few days or within the first few weeks, he intends to approach the leaders of Russia and Ukraine, putting them at the negotiation table and using stick and carrot for both. That's what we know from Pompeo. That's likely scenario. So I think he will act on that if on that particular step. Whether two sides, maybe with some other countries participating in those negotiations, will reach an agreement, and when they will reach an agreement, I don't think that really that will depend on Mr. Trump's wishes. The negotiations that brought ceasefire to Korea were going for more than 2 years. Mm-hmm. The negotiations on Vietnam were also going for 2, maybe 3 years. Mm-hmm. So negotiations is a process. So in that sense, I treat seriously the intention to put the two sides at the negotiation table, and I think that the chances of Trump achieving that are relatively high if he decides to do that. But whether that will produce the results or not, I will go back to my earlier statement that it all depends on when the Russia decides that it actually can't achieve more on the front line. Yeah. Once Russia decides that, the West will go along.
Serhii, I want to thank you for coming on the program today and chatting with me. And I encourage everybody to pick up a copy of your brand new book, Chernobyl Roulette. I'm glad we had a moment to speak about that today. I'm glad you're bringing attention to, the real nuclear threat and talking about that, because quite frankly, before I stumbled, yes, media covers conflicts surrounding the nuclear power plants and why this is a risk. You do a much better job at getting to the significance and importance of this. And so I think you've written a very important book.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, thank you for writing it. And your nine other books. Was this your 10th book?
I have written a number of books. The one on the Russo-Ukrainian war is this one. Just in September it appeared in paperback, so it's now quite affordable, not only in the United States but in Canada as well. Yeah. Okay. I appreciate that. Yeah, and mad respect for the amount of content you were able to write. By the way, huge undertaking. So thank you for that, and congratulations. And thanks again for coming on my program today. I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. Thank you. Likewise.
All right.